Rebecca walked across the scorching asphalt of Fort Carson's Advanced Marksmanship Training Facility, her standard-issue clipboard clutched against her chest like armor. The morning sun painted the Colorado mountains in shades of amber, but she barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversation from 3 days ago that had turned her world upside down. Administrative reassignment, Colonel Harrison had said, not even looking up from his paperwork. Effective immediately. You'll be working logistics coordination for the training ranges. Observer status only. Observer status. The words still stung like a slap across the face. After 8 years of active duty, after everything she'd sacrificed, she was being shuffled into a desk job disguised as field work. The official reason was operational restructuring, but Rebecca knew the real story. Her last mission had gone sideways, not because of anything she'd done wrong, but because someone higher up needed a scapegoat. Politics and blame had a way of rolling downhill, and she'd been standing at the bottom. The Desert Valley training range stretched before her like a moonscape, all rocky outcroppings and sand-colored earth that seemed to absorb sound and hope in equal measure. This was where the elite reconnaissance teams came to prove themselves, where careers were made or broken based on split-second decisions and millimeter precision. Rebecca had once belonged here, had earned her place through blood, sweat, and countless sleepless nights perfecting her craft. Now she was just furniture. The range was already buzzing with activity despite the early hour. Voices carried across the valley, mostly male, mostly confident, mostly discussing their latest scores and betting on who could outshoot whom in the day's trials. Rebecca recognized some of the faces from her previous assignments, but they looked right through her now. Without her combat insignia, without her sidearm, without any visible rank or specialty markings, she might as well have been invisible. She found her assigned station near the equipment shed, a folding table with a weather-beaten umbrella that provided maybe 3 square feet of shade. Her job description was simple: observe and document. Record environmental conditions, note. Equipment usage, maintain attendance logs. Glorified secretarial work dressed up with military terminology. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb approached her table with the kind of swagger that came from knowing everyone was watching. He was one of the range's top instructors, a man whose reputation was built on making difficult shots look effortless and making weaker shooters feel inadequate. His eyes swept over Rebecca's plain uniform and clipboard with obvious dismissal. "You the new admin support?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "Make sure you stay clear of the firing line during live exercises. We've got real work to do out here." Rebecca nodded politely, swallowing the urge to remind him that she'd probably logged more range time than half his students combined. Instead, she clicked her pen and prepared to document whatever testosterone-fueled competition was about to unfold. The morning progressed exactly as she'd expected. Shooters lined up to demonstrate their skills, each trying to outdo the last. Money changed hands on side bets. Voices grew louder as the sun climbed higher. Rebecca dutifully recorded wind speeds, temperature readings, and ammunition expenditures, all while feeling like a ghost haunting her former life. It was during the lunch break that she overheard the conversation that would change everything. "Did you see the new paper pusher?" one of the younger snipers was saying to his buddy. "Command must be scraping the bottom of the barrel for support staff these days." "I heard she's some kind of washout," another voice chimed in. "Probably. Couldn't handle the pressure of real field work." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, the kind that sliced deeper than any physical wound. Rebecca kept her eyes on her paperwork, her pen moving steadily across the page, but her jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. These men had no idea who she was, what she'd accomplished, or what she'd sacrificed. To them, she was just another anonymous face in the support staff, unworthy of their respect or recognition. But what hurt most wasn't their dismissal. It was the grain of truth in their mockery. She was a washout, in a sense. Not because she couldn't handle the pressure, but because she'd been thrown under the bus by people who valued politics over performance. The mission she'd completed successfully didn't matter now. The lives she'd saved were forgotten. All that remained was a clipboard and a folding chair in the desert heat. As the afternoon session began, Rebecca noticed something that made her stomach tighten with anticipation. The shooters were setting up for long-range precision trials, using targets positioned at extreme distances across the valley. This was serious business, the kind of challenge that separated the truly skilled from the merely competent. She watched them prepare their equipment with practiced efficiency-expensive rifle systems, high-end optics, electronic rangefinders, and weather monitoring devices. Everything was precise, calculated, professional. These were good shooters, some of them excellent. But as Rebecca observed their techniques, old instincts began to stir. She found herself reading the wind patterns without conscious thought, noting the way air currents moved differently at various elevations across the valley. Her eyes tracked dust particles and vegetation movement, calculating drift compensation that would be needed for shots at different ranges. It was muscle memory, mental conditioning that years of training had burned into her brain. The familiar ache of longing settled in her chest like a physical weight. This was her world, her language, her calling, and she was trapped on the sidelines, reduced to watching others do what she'd once done better than almost anyone alive. As the day wore on, the competitive atmosphere grew more intense. Bets were placed on increasingly difficult shots. Voices carried farther as egos inflated with each successful hit. Rebecca continued her documentation, invisible and ignored, while inside her the fire that had made her legendary began to smolder with renewed heat. She didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would bring an opportunity that would change everything. Tomorrow, they would hand her a rifle as a joke, never imagining that they were about to awaken something they weren't prepared to face. The second day dawned even hotter than the first, with the kind of dry heat that made mirages dance on the horizon and turned metal surfaces into branding irons. Rebecca arrived at her station early, hoping to avoid the worst of the sun, but knowing that her plastic chair and flimsy umbrella offered little protection against the Colorado desert's relentless assault. The range was already active when she settled in with her clipboard and thermos of coffee. Today's session promised to be special. Word had spread about a visiting team of snipers from Fort Bragg who'd come to test their skills against the local talent. The betting pools had tripled overnight, and the usual posturing had reached new levels of intensity. Rebecca watched the newcomers arrive with professional interest. They moved with the fluid confidence of men who'd seen real combat, their equipment cases bearing the scuffs and scratches that came from actual field use rather than range time. Their leader, a lean man with prematurely gray hair and eyes like winter sky, supervised the unpacking of their gear with quiet authority. "That's Master Sergeant Patrick Kane," she heard someone whisper nearby. "3 tours downrange, confirmed. Kills in double digits. Guy's a legend." Rebecca recognized the type immediately, the kind of operator who let his rifle do the talking. She'd worked alongside men like Kane before, back when she'd worn different insignia and carried different responsibilities. The recognition brought another sharp pang of loss, quickly suppressed. Staff Sergeant Webb was clearly feeling the pressure of the visiting competition. His usual cocky demeanor had taken on a harder edge, and he was barking orders at his students with less patience than usual. Rebecca noticed him glancing repeatedly at Kane's team, sizing them up like a prizefighter studying his opponent. "All right, listen up," Webb announced to the assembled shooters. "We've got guests today, and I don't intend to embarrass this facility. I want to see your absolute best work out there. No excuses, no second chances. The morning progressed with escalating displays of marksmanship. Targets were placed at increasingly challenging distances. Environmental conditions were monitored with obsessive precision, and each successful shot was celebrated like a minor victory. Rebecca dutifully recorded it all, her pen scratching across forms that would be filed away and forgotten. It was during a brief equipment check that Kane approached her table. Up close, she could see the weathered lines around his eyes, the kind that came from squinting through scopes in hostile territory. His gaze was direct, but not unkind, as he looked at her clipboard and administrative badge. "How long have you been working range support?" he asked, his voice carrying just a hint of southern drawl. "This is my second day," Rebecca replied honestly. Kane nodded slowly, his eyes studying her face with the careful attention of someone trained to read people. "Mind if I ask what you did before this assignment?" The question caught Rebecca off guard. Most people assumed she'd always been support staff, that this was the extent of her military experience. She hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "Various duties," she said finally. "Standard rotation assignments." Something flickered in Kane's expression, a flash of recognition or suspicion that was gone too quickly to interpret. He started to say something else, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he nodded politely and moved away, leaving Rebecca with the uncomfortable feeling that he'd seen more than she'd intended to show. The afternoon brought the main event, a precision shooting competition between the home team and the FUS visitors. Targets were set at extreme range, nearly 1,600 yards across broken terrain that would challenge even experienced marksmen. The betting reached fever pitch as shooters from both teams prepared their equipment with ritualistic care. Rebecca found herself drawn into the competition, despite her observer status. Old habits died hard, and she couldn't help analyzing the shooters' techniques, noting their strengths and weaknesses. Webb was better than good, actually, but she could see the subtle signs of tension in his posture that suggested he was feeling the pressure. Kane's team moved with practiced efficiency, their movements economical and precise. The shots began with methodical regularity. Each shooter had 3 attempts at the target, with scores averaged to determine the winner. The home team started strong, with several respectable hits that drew appreciative comments from the crowd. But Kane's team answered with shots that were consistently tighter, more precise. As the competition progressed, Rebecca noticed something that made her frown with concern. The wind patterns were shifting more dramatically than the electronic monitoring equipment was registering. The valley's unique topography created complex air currents that the standard instruments couldn't track accurately. She'd seen similar conditions before, in places where the difference between a hit and a miss could mean the difference between life and death. Several shooters missed their targets completely, their shots thrown off by wind drift they hadn't accounted for. The misses were met with frustrated cursing and equipment adjustments that wouldn't solve the real problem. Rebecca watched with growing frustration as shooter after shooter failed to read the conditions properly. Webb was up next, and Rebecca could see the strain in his face as he settled into position. He'd been talking a big game all day, but now the pressure was showing. His breathing was slightly elevated, his grip on the rifle just a fraction too tight. These were small things, invisible to most observers, but Rebecca's trained eye caught them all. The shot went wide, missing the target by several inches. Webb's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger as he checked and rechecked his equipment, looking for some mechanical explanation for his failure. The crowd fell silent, the earlier bravado replaced by uncomfortable tension. "Tough conditions out there," Kane observed mildly, but his tone carried an undertone that suggested he understood the real problem. That's when Webb made his mistake. Frustrated by his poor performance and stung by the presence of the visiting team, he looked around for someone to blame. His eyes fell on Rebecca, sitting quietly at her table with her clipboard and administrative badge. "Maybe if we had proper range support instead of whatever this is," he said loudly, gesturing in her direction, "we'd have better environmental data to work with." The comment hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She'd been documenting conditions meticulously, recording every detail that her instruments could measure. The problem wasn't her data. It was the shooter's inability to read conditions that their equipment couldn't detect. But she said nothing. She just sat there, absorbing the unjust accusation while the crowd murmured agreement. In their minds, she was the obvious scapegoat, the anonymous support staffer who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of precision shooting. Kane was watching the exchange with sharp interest, his winter blue eyes moving between Webb and Rebecca like he was solving a puzzle. When their gazes met briefly, Rebecca saw something there that made her heart skip recognition, perhaps or suspicion that there was more to her story than met the eye. The competition continued, but the atmosphere had soured. More shots missed their marks, more frustration built, and more sidelong glances were thrown in Rebecca's direction. She was becoming the unofficial explanation for everyone's poor performance, the convenient target for their wounded pride. As the day drew to a close and equipment was packed away, Rebecca overheard fragments of conversation that made her stomach knot with dread. Completely useless support staff. Should've. Someone who actually understands shooting. Probably doesn't know the difference between a rifle and a shotgun. The words followed her as she gathered her own materials and prepared to leave. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, more mockery, more blame, more slow erosion of her dignity and self-worth. She was trapped in a position where she couldn't defend herself without revealing secrets that weren't hers to tell. But as she walked toward the parking area, clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield, Rebecca felt something stirring deep inside her chest. It was anger, yes, but something more than that. It was the competitive fire that had made her legendary. In communities these men had never heard of, the driving need to prove herself that had carried her through the darkest moments of her career. They thought she was nobody. They thought she was weak, incompetent, unworthy of their respect. Tomorrow, if the opportunity arose, she might just show them how wrong they were. The third day brought ominous changes that Rebecca noticed immediately. Her folding table had been moved farther from the firing line, positioned behind a concrete barrier that blocked her view of most activities. Her equipment request for a backup weather monitoring device had been denied without explanation. And when she'd arrived at the supply office to collect fresh data sheets, the clerk had handed them over with barely concealed contempt. "Try to get the paperwork right this time," he'd said with a smirk. "We don't need any more excuses for poor performance." The message was clear. She was being systematically isolated and blamed for problems she hadn't created. Rebecca recognized the pattern from previous assignments, the slow squeeze of institutional pressure designed to make unwanted personnel quit voluntarily. It was easier than formal disciplinary action and avoided uncomfortable questions about fairness or due process. But Rebecca had survived worse than bureaucratic harassment. She settled into her relocated position with grim determination, prepared to document whatever fresh humiliation the day might bring. The morning session began with increased security measures that seemed specifically designed to limit her access. New barriers had been erected around the ammunition storage area. Additional personnel checks were being conducted at random intervals. Most telling of all, a new supervision protocol required all support staff to remain in designated areas unless specifically authorized to move. Rebecca understood the subtext perfectly. They were building a case, creating a paper trail that would justify her eventual removal from even this diminished role. Every restriction, every barrier, every small indignity was being carefully documented by someone higher up the chain of command. Staff Sergeant Webb seemed particularly energized by the new arrangements. He moved through the range with renewed swagger, his voice carrying farther as he addressed his students. "That's what I'm talking about," he announced after a particularly good shot. "When everyone does their job properly, excellence follows naturally." The comment was aimed directly at Rebecca, delivered with enough theatrical emphasis to ensure everyone understood the intended target. Several shooters chuckled appreciatively, enjoying the spectacle of someone else's humiliation. The visiting team from Fort Bragg was still present, their competition having extended into a longer evaluation period. Master Sergeant Kane continued to watch Rebecca with those winter blue eyes, his expression unreadable but somehow supportive. During a brief break in the morning session, he approached her isolated station. "Interesting setup they've got you working with," he observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Standard protocols," Rebecca replied, not trusting herself to say more. Kane nodded slowly, his gaze taking in the barriers and restrictions surrounding her position. "Mind if I ask you something?" Rebecca looked up from her clipboard, meeting his direct stare. "That wind data you recorded yesterday," Kane continued. "The patterns you documented in Sector 7 between 1400 and 1500 hours. How did you calculate those variations without direct instrumentation in that grid?" The question hit Rebecca like a lightning bolt. Sector 7 had been a blind spot for the standard monitoring equipment, an area where complex terrain features created microclimates that couldn't be measured remotely. She'd estimated the conditions based on visual cues and experience, the kind of fieldcraft that came from years of practical application. But admitting that level of expertise would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. "Educated guesswork," she said finally. Kane's eyes narrowed slightly. "That was some pretty sophisticated guesswork. Those calculations were dead-on accurate." Before Rebecca could respond, Webb's voice cut across the range like a whip crack. "Sergeant Kane, if you're done socializing with the support staff, we're ready to begin the afternoon trials." The dismissal was pointed and rude, designed to put both Kane and Rebecca in their places. Kane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he simply nodded and walked away without another word. The afternoon brought the most challenging shooting trials yet. Targets were positioned at maximum range across terrain that would test every aspect of the shooter's skills. Environmental conditions were marginal at best, with shifting winds and variable lighting that made accurate shooting extremely difficult. Rebecca watched from her isolated position as shooter after shooter struggled with the conditions. Shots went wide, scores dropped, and frustration mounted with each failed attempt. The electronic monitoring equipment was providing data, but it wasn't capturing the subtle variations that were throwing off the calculations. She could see the problems clearly wind shear at different elevations, thermal updrafts from sun-heated rock faces, atmospheric pressure variations caused by the valley's unique geography. These were conditions she'd learned to read through hard experience in places where missing meant dying. But she was trapped behind her barriers, reduced to recording failures she could have prevented if anyone had been willing to listen. The breaking point came during Webb's attempt at a particularly challenging shot. He'd been building up to this moment all day, talking about technique and precision while positioning himself as the undisputed master of the range. The target was positioned at nearly 1,700 yards, requiring perfect calculation and flawless execution. Webb settled into position with theatrical precision, taking longer than necessary to adjust his equipment. The crowd gathered closer, money changing hands as bets were placed on his success. Rebecca could see the wind patterns shifting across the valley, creating conditions that would require significant compensation. The shot cracked across the desert like thunder. A long second passed in silence. Then the spotter's voice came through the radio. "Miss. Wide right by approximately 18 inches. The silence that followed was deafening, Webb's face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. He checked his equipment furiously, looking for some mechanical explanation for his failure. "This is ridiculous," he announced loudly. "How is anyone supposed to shoot accurately with defective environmental data?" His eyes found Rebecca across the range, and she felt the weight of his fury like a physical force. 3 days of useless readings, Webb continued, his voice rising. 3 days of incompetent support work that's making this entire facility look like amateurs. The unfairness of the accusation hit Rebecca like a slap. Her data had been accurate within the limits of her equipment. The problem wasn't her readings. It was the shooter's inability to adapt to conditions their instruments couldn't measure. But the crowd was buying Webb's explanation. Heads were nodding. Voices were murmuring agreement. She was the perfect scapegoat for their collective failure. "Maybe," Webb said with poisonous satisfaction, "it's time we got someone in that position who actually understands what real shooting requires." That's when something inside Rebecca finally snapped. Not into anger or outrage, but into a cold, calculating determination that she recognized from her most dangerous missions. The feeling was familiar and welcome, the moment when emotion fell away and pure tactical thinking took control. She stood up slowly, clipboard in hand, and walked toward the firing line with measured steps. "Staff Sergeant Webb," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the range, "I believe there may be an issue with your wind calculations." The crowd turned to stare at her with a mixture of shock and amusement. The anonymous support staffer was actually speaking up, actually challenging the range's top instructor in front of everyone. Webb's expression was pure predatory satisfaction. "Oh, really? And what makes you think you're qualified to comment on advanced marksmanship calculations?" Rebecca met his stare without flinching. "Because your shot was compensated for a 10-mile-per-hour crosswind, but the actual conditions in Sector 7 were closer to 14 miles per hour with a variable component that shifted twice during your hold." The specificity of her analysis caught everyone off guard. This wasn't the generic protest of an offended bureaucrat. This was technical precision that suggested deep understanding. Webb's smile became cruel. "Well then, if you're such an expert, maybe you'd like to demonstrate these superior skills." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a fired shot. Rebecca looked around the range, seeing faces that ranged from curious to openly hostile. Master Sergeant Kane was watching with sharp attention, his expression unreadable. "I don't think that would be appropriate," Rebecca said carefully. "Oh, I think it would be very appropriate," Webb replied. "In fact, I insist. If you're going to criticize the performance of qualified personnel, you should be prepared to back up your criticism with action." The trap was obvious. If she declined, she'd be marked as all talk and no substance. If she accepted and failed, she'd be publicly humiliated and probably removed from her position entirely. If she accepted and succeeded, well, that would raise questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. But as she looked around the range, at the faces full of contempt and dismissal, Rebecca realized she was tired of hiding, tired of being invisible, tired of watching others fail at tasks she could perform in her sleep. "All right," she said quietly, "I'll take the shot." The crowd's reaction was immediate laughter, disbelief, eager anticipation of her humiliation. Money began changing hands as new bets were placed on the outcome. Someone started to set up a standard training rifle, but Webb held up his hand. "No," he said with malicious glee. "If she's going to play with the big boys, she should use big boy equipment." He gestured toward his personal rifle, a custom precision system worth more than most people's cars. The weapon was beautifully crafted and perfectly maintained, but Rebecca could see it was set up specifically for Webb's shooting style and physical dimensions. "Staff Sergeant Webb," Kane interrupted, "that rifle isn't properly configured for The lady wanted to demonstrate her expertise. Webb cut him off. I'm just giving her the opportunity. Rebecca walked toward the weapon with steady steps, her mind already shifting into the cold calculation mode that had kept her alive through dozens of impossible missions. She could feel every eye on the range watching her, could sense the mixture of anticipation and contempt that surrounded her like fog. As her hands closed around the rifle, muscle memory older than her current assignment took control. The weapon felt familiar despite its unfamiliar configuration, like a language she'd spoken fluently before learning to fear the consequences of her own fluency. Behind her, she heard Webb's voice carrying across the range. This should be entertaining. But Master Sergeant Kane had gone very quiet, and his winter blue eyes had taken on the sharp focus of someone who just recognized a predator in sheep's clothing. Rebecca's hands closed around the rifle with practiced ease, and immediately she felt the subtle wrongness of the weapon's configuration. The stock length was set for someone with longer arms, the cheek rest positioned too high for her facial structure, and the trigger pull weight was heavier than she preferred. These were obstacles that would challenge any shooter, exactly what Webb had intended. But as she lifted the rifle and felt its weight distribute across her body, something fundamental shifted inside her. The clipboard-carrying administrator began to fade, replaced by someone whose muscle memory had been forged in places these men couldn't imagine. Take your time, Webb called out with false generosity. No rush. We know this is probably your first time handling anything more complex than a stapler. The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, but Rebecca barely heard it. Her attention had narrowed to the technical challenge before her. The target was positioned at 1,700 yards across broken terrain, the same distance that had defeated Webb minutes earlier. Wind conditions remained variable and complex, with thermal updrafts creating additional complications that the standard monitoring equipment couldn't detect. She knelt beside the rifle, beginning the process of adaptation that would allow her to work within the weapon's limitations. Her movements were economical and precise, each adjustment calculated to maximize her effectiveness despite the poor fit. Need help figuring out which end the bullets come out of? Someone called from the crowd, drawing another wave of laughter. Rebecca ignored the mockery, her focus entirely on the task ahead. She adjusted the bipod legs for optimal stability, compensated for the stock length by modifying her grip, and began the mental calculations that would account for the weapon's specific ballistic characteristics. Master Sergeant Kane had moved closer to the firing line, his expression shifting from curiosity to something approaching concern. Unlike the others, he seemed to recognize that Rebecca's preparations were anything but amateur. Her movements had the fluid efficiency of someone who'd performed these tasks thousands of times under conditions far more stressful than a training range competition. This is taking longer than I expected, Webb announced. Maybe she's having second thoughts about her bold claims. Rebecca finally looked up from her preparations, meeting Webb's gaze with eyes that had gone cold and distant. I'm ready. The change in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. The apologetic support staffer had been replaced by someone whose presence commanded attention. Several of the closer observers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the transformation without understanding its source. Rebecca settled into a prone position behind the rifle, her body forming the stable platform that precision shooting demanded. The weapon still didn't fit properly, but she'd adapted her technique to work within its constraints. Her breathing settled into the slow rhythm that would provide the foundation for an accurate shot. Through the scope, the distant target appeared as a small steel silhouette shimmering in the desert heat. 1,700 yards across terrain that would challenge the most experienced marksman. Rebecca studied the target through the optics, noting the way heat waves distorted the image and affected her range estimation. But her real attention was focused on the environmental conditions that the crowd couldn't see. She watched dust particles dancing in the air, noting their movement patterns at different elevations. A small bird circling overhead told her about wind directions at altitude. The way vegetation moved near the target revealed surface wind conditions that her instruments couldn't measure from this distance. These were skills that couldn't be taught in any manual, abilities developed through years of practical application. In hostile environments where accuracy meant survival, Rebecca synthesized the information with the unconscious ease of someone who'd learned to read terrain like others read books. The wind patterns were complex, but not chaotic. There was a rhythm to the air movement, a predictable cycle that repeated every 40 to 50 seconds. Surface winds running left to right at approximately 8 miles per hour, with a thermal component creating vertical lift near the target position. At mid-range, a crosswind of 12 to 14 miles per hour would push the bullet significantly off course if not properly compensated. Rebecca waited, her finger resting lightly on the trigger, feeling the weapon's heartbeat through her body. The crowd behind her had grown quiet, perhaps sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Any day now," Webb called out, but his voice carried less confidence than before. Rebecca ignored him, her entire being focused on the target and the conditions between her position and the distant steel. She felt the wind pattern beginning its cycle, watched dust particles shift direction, noted the way atmospheric pressure seemed to change with subtle variations in sound quality. The moment of stillness came exactly when her experience told her it would, a brief window when all the variables aligned in her favor. Her breathing stopped at the natural pause between inhale and exhale. Her trigger finger applied pressure. With mechanical precision, the rifle roared, its muzzle blast echoing off the surrounding canyon walls like thunder. The recoil, heavier than she was accustomed to, drove into her shoulder with significant force. But Rebecca absorbed the impact perfectly, maintaining her sight picture to observe the bullet's flight. 1,700 yards was a long way for any projectile to travel. Physics and environmental factors had nearly 3 seconds to work their influence on the bullet's path. Rebecca lay motionless behind the rifle, her experience telling her the shot had been true, but knowing that confidence meant nothing until the target confirmed success or failure. The silence stretched across the range like a held breath. Electronic. Equipment beeped softly as spotters checked their instruments. Binoculars were raised to examine the distant target. The crowd waited with the kind of tense anticipation that accompanied moments of truth. Then the spotter's voice crackled through the radio, clear and stunned. Dead center hit. Perfect impact. The silence that followed was deeper than before, heavy with disbelief and growing awareness that something unprecedented had just occurred. Rebecca remained in position, her eyes still pressed to the scope, watching the target through the heat shimmer that had made the shot so challenging. She'd known the shot was good from the moment she'd squeezed the trigger. The rifle's recoil pattern, the sound of the muzzle blast, the feel of the weapon's response, all had told her the bullet was flying true. But confirmation still brought a familiar satisfaction, the quiet pride of a job done well under difficult circumstances. Behind her, she could hear voices beginning to stir, fragments of conversation that suggested the crowd was struggling to process what they'd witnessed. That was ... did she ... lucky shot. Had to be. From 1,700 yards? That's not luck. That's... Rebecca rose gracefully from her prone position, her movements controlled and professional. She engaged the rifle's safety, checked the chamber, and began the process of making the weapon safe for return to its owner. Her face showed no emotion, no sign of the satisfaction she felt at having silenced her critics so definitively. Webb was staring at her with an expression of stunned disbelief. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. The cool amusement had drained from his face, replaced by something approaching fear. "How?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca handed him his rifle with the same calm professionalism she'd shown throughout the ordeal. "You were right about the wind conditions being challenging," she said quietly. "But your compensation calculations were based on surface readings only. You didn't account for the thermal layer at mid-range or the pressure differential near the PO target." The technical explanation was delivered in the same tone she might have used to discuss the weather, but its implications were staggering. This level of environmental analysis required years of advanced training and practical experience that few marksmen ever achieved. Master Sergeant Kane stepped forward, his winter blue eyes sharp with new understanding. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "might I ask where you received your marksmanship training?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fired shot. Rebecca looked around the range, seeing faces that had transformed from mockery to confusion to something approaching awe. These men were trying to reconcile the anonymous support staffer they'd dismissed with the precision shooter who just accomplished something they believed impossible. "Various assignments," Rebecca replied, using the same non-answer she'd given before. But now the words carried different weight, suggested depths of experience that hadn't been apparent when she'd been hiding behind her clipboard. The sound of footsteps on gravel announced the arrival of Colonel Harrison, the base commander whose decision had relegated Rebecca to her current assignment. He approached the firing line with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command. But his expression suggested he'd heard enough over the radio to know that something significant had occurred. "What's the situation here?" he asked, his gaze moving between Rebecca and the assembled crowd. Webb struggled to find his voice. "Sir, the support technician just made a shot at 1,700 yards. Dead center hit." Harrison's eyes found Rebecca, studying her with new attention. "Is that so?" The colonel's tone was carefully neutral, but Rebecca could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was a career officer who'd survived and prospered by understanding the political currents that flowed through military institutions. The fact that his scapegoat had just demonstrated world-class marksmanship skills was a development with potentially serious ramifications. "Just doing my job, sir," Rebecca replied, her voice steady and professional. But they all knew that what had just happened went far beyond any job description for support personnel. The question now was what would happen next, and whether Rebecca was prepared for the scrutiny that her demonstration of skill would inevitably bring. The afternoon sun continued its relentless assault on the desert training range, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The easy camaraderie and casual mockery had been replaced by uncertain tension and growing questions that no one seemed prepared to answer. Rebecca walked back toward her isolated station, clipboard in hand, leaving behind a crowd of men who were struggling to understand what they'd witnessed. But she could feel their eyes following her, could sense the conversations that would begin as soon as she was out of earshot. The game had changed. The question now was whether she was ready for what would come next. The morning of the fourth day brought changes that Rebecca noticed immediately upon arriving at the range. Her isolated station had been moved again, this time to a position where she had clear sight lines to most of the training activities. The concrete barriers that had blocked her view were gone, replaced by a simple table and chair positioned in full view of the firing line. More significantly, there was a manila folder waiting on her table, thick, official-looking, and marked with classification stamps that made her stomach tighten with recognition. Someone had been busy overnight, pulling records that weren't supposed to exist. Rebecca sat down carefully, acutely aware that every movement was being observed. Staff Sergeant Webb was already at his station, but he kept glancing in her direction with an expression that mixed wariness with something approaching. Fear. The easy confidence that had defined his previous interactions with her was completely gone. Master Sergeant Kane approached her table with 2 cups of coffee, moving with the deliberate casualness of someone who wanted the interaction to appear accidental. He set one cup beside her folder without asking permission. "Thought you might need this," he said quietly. "Going to be a long day." Rebecca accepted the coffee with a nod of gratitude, but her attention was focused on the folder. She recognized the classification level, the document format, the particular shade of manila that indicated personnel records from Special Operations Divisions. Someone with significant clearance had been digging into her background. "Interesting reading material," Kane observed, settling into a chair beside her table without invitation. "I haven't opened it yet," Rebecca replied honestly. "Might want to before Colonel Harrison arrives. Word is he's bringing some friends from higher up the food chain." The warning was delivered in Kane's characteristic drawl, but Rebecca could hear the underlying tension. Whatever was in that folder, it was significant enough to attract attention from well above the base level. Rebecca opened the folder carefully, acutely aware that Kane was watching her reaction with professional interest. The first document was a standard personnel summary, but even the unclassified portions told a story that would explain yesterday's demonstration. Former designation: independent contractor, Tier 1 operations. Operational call sign Go 6. Confirmed eliminations 27. Maximum engagement distance 2,100 yards under hostile conditions. The summary was clinical and brief, but each line represented months or years of the most dangerous work the military had to offer. Rebecca had hoped this information would remain buried, but apparently yesterday's shot had been impressive enough to prompt a serious investigation. "Go 6, Kane said quietly, reading over her shoulder. "I thought that was just a legend." Rebecca looked up at him sharply. "You've heard the call sign?" "Heard stories. Contractor who could make impossible shots in places where regular snipers couldn't operate. Afghanistan, Syria, some locations that officially don't exist." Kane's winter blue eyes were studying her face with new respect. The story said Go 6 was a ghost story, someone who might not actually exist. The stories were wrong about a lot of things, Rebecca said carefully. Kane nodded slowly, like the assumption that Go 6 was male. Before Rebecca could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of Colonel Harrison and his promised reinforcements. 3 black SUVs pulled up to the range entrance, disgorging personnel whose bearing and equipment suggested they were well above the base pay grade. Rebecca closed the folder and straightened in her chair, preparing for whatever was about to unfold. The easy anonymity of her support staff assignment was clearly over, replaced by scrutiny that would determine whether her career had any future at all. Colonel Harrison approached with 2 men in civilian clothes whose posture and bearing screamed federal agents. Behind them walked an older woman in dress uniform whose insignia indicated a rank that commanded serious respect throughout the military hierarchy. "Miss Thompson," Colonel Harrison said formally, using her name for the first time since her assignment began. "These gentlemen would like to speak with you about yesterday's demonstration." The taller of the 2 civilians stepped forward, his credentials already in hand. "Agent Michael Stevens, Defense Intelligence Agency. This is Agent Robert Chun. We understand you made quite an impression on the range yesterday." Rebecca remained seated, her expression neutral. "I fired 1 shot at the request of range personnel." "1 shot," Agent Stevens repeated. "At 1,700 yards, using an unfamiliar weapon, under challenging environmental conditions. That's the kind of marksmanship that attracts attention." "Ma'am," the uniformed woman interrupted. "I'm Brigadier General Patricia Williams, Special Operations Command. I believe we may have worked together previously, though under different circumstances." Rebecca studied the general's face, searching her memory for a connection. The name was familiar, but the context remained unclear. Too many missions, too many briefings, too many faces that had appeared and disappeared from her operational world. "I'm sorry, General, but I don't recall our paths crossing." General Williams smiled grimly. Operation Desert Lance, 18 months ago. You provided overwatch for an extraction in a location that officially never happened. My people made it home because someone was covering their movement from an impossible position. The memory clicked into place with uncomfortable clarity. Rebecca remembered the mission, a high-value target extraction that had gone sideways when local forces surrounded the extraction team. She'd been positioned nearly 2 miles away, providing cover fire that had allowed the team to fight their way to safety. I was part of a larger operational team, Rebecca said carefully. You were the only sniper who could have made those shots, General Williams replied. My after-action report specifically mentioned the precision of the cover fire. Elimination of 6 hostile targets at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards in darkness, with significant environmental challenges. Agent Stevens was taking notes, his pen scratching across a small notebook. Ms. Thompson, your current assignment seems somewhat inconsistent with your apparent skill level. Rebecca felt the weight of multiple gazes, aware that her next words would determine the direction of this conversation. Behind the officials, she could see range personnel gathering at a respectful distance, clearly curious about the high-level attention their humble facility was receiving. I was reassigned to administrative duties following a mission review, she said finally. The details are classified above my current clearance level. Agent Chun spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat precision of someone accustomed to interrogation. Ms. Thompson, we've reviewed your personnel file. The mission you're referring to is Operation Iron Gate, correct? Rebecca's stomach tightened. Iron Gate had been the disaster that had ended her operational career, the mission where politics and reality had collided with devastating consequences. Someone had thrown her under the bus to protect higher-level interests, and her protests had been buried under classification stamps and bureaucratic maneuvering. I'm not authorized to discuss Operation Iron Gate, she replied. Actually, General Williams interjected. You are. As of 6 hours ago, your security clearance has been fully restored, along with access to all operational records related to your case. The news hit Rebecca like a physical blow. For months, she'd been fighting through official channels to get her clearance restored, to gain access to the evidence that would vindicate her actions. Every request had been denied, every appeal dismissed, every avenue of redress blocked by administrative stonewalling. I don't understand, she said quietly. Agent Stevens leaned forward slightly. Yesterday's demonstration raised some questions about the circumstances of your reassignment. When we started pulling files, we discovered some inconsistencies in the official reports. What kind of inconsistencies? General Williams opened a briefcase and withdrew a thick folder marked with classification stamps that indicated serious secrets. The kind that suggests someone went to considerable effort to bury the truth about what really happened during Iron Gate. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the folder. Inside were documents she'd never seen before: intercepts, surveillance reports, forensic analyses that painted a picture very different from the one that had destroyed her career. The mission had been compromised from the beginning. Intelligence failures, political interference, and command decisions that had prioritized expedience over accuracy. Rebecca's actions hadn't caused the mission failure. They prevented a complete disaster that would have cost dozens of lives. This evidence has been available all along, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hidden, Agent Chung corrected. Someone with significant influence made sure these files never saw the light of day. Someone who needed a scapegoat to cover their own failures. Rebecca felt a cold rage building in her chest, the kind of fury that had nothing to do with emotion, and everything to do with justice delayed and denied. She'd spent months believing that she'd failed, that her actions had compromised a mission and endangered lives. The truth was exactly the opposite. Who she asked. General Williams and Agent Stevens exchanged glances, a silent communication. That suggested they'd reached the crucial moment of this conversation. "That's what we're here to find out," Stevens said. "But we need your help. We need someone who understands the operational details, someone who can help us identify the people responsible for burying this evidence." Rebecca looked around the range, seeing familiar faces that now carried different meanings. Staff Sergeant Webb was watching from a distance, his expression suggesting he was beginning to understand that his casual mockery had targeted someone far more dangerous than he'd realized. Master Sergeant Kane caught her eye and nodded slightly, a gesture of support from someone who understood the weight of what was being revealed. These were career military personnel who recognized injustice when they saw it, who understood that what had happened to Rebecca could happen to any of them. "What exactly are you proposing?" Rebecca asked. "Full investigation," General Williams replied. "Complete review of Operation Iron Gate and the subsequent cover-up. Identification and prosecution of everyone involved in burying the evidence. And in return, full reinstatement to your previous position and rank, complete vindication of your actions, and the opportunity to help ensure this never happens to anyone else." Rebecca closed the folder carefully, her mind racing through the implications of what was being offered. Justice, vindication, and the chance to return to the work she'd been born to do. But also exposure, scrutiny, and the inevitable consequences of challenging people with the power to destroy careers. "I need time to consider this," she said finally. Agent Stevens nodded. "You have until tomorrow morning. But Ms. Thompson... He paused, his expression growing serious. "The people who did this to you are still in positions of power. Every day we delay gives them more time to cover their tracks." As the officials departed, leaving Rebecca alone with her thoughts and a folder full of vindication, she felt the weight of decision pressing down on her shoulders. The safe path would be to decline, to remain invisible in her administrative role, to avoid the risks that came with challenging institutional power. But as she looked across the range where she'd been humiliated and dismissed, where her expertise had been mocked and her contributions ignored, Rebecca felt the fire that had made her legendary beginning to burn with renewed intensity. They'd tried to bury her. They'd tried to erase her contributions and hide their own failures behind her destroyed reputation. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether she was ready to fight back. Rebecca didn't sleep that night. She sat in her small apartment going through the declassified files, each document adding another piece to a puzzle that revealed the scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed her career. By morning, her decision was made. She arrived at the range early, before the first scheduled training session, carrying herself with a confidence that had been absent since her reassignment. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The way she walked, the set of her shoulders, the direct way she met people's eyes. The apologetic support staffer was gone, replaced by someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. Agent Stevens and General Williams were waiting at her table, along with a new face, a woman in an expensive suit whose bearing suggested serious legal authority. "Ms. Thompson," General Williams said as Rebecca approached, "this is Laura Martinez, Chief Counsel for the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. She'd be handling the legal aspects of our investigation." Rebecca shook hands with the lawyer, noting the firm grip and direct gaze that suggested someone accustomed to high-stakes litigation. "I've reviewed your case file," Martinez said without preamble. "What was done to you represents one of the most egregious examples of institutional cover-up I've encountered in 20 years of military law. And you believe we can prove it? With your cooperation, yes. The evidence is strong, but we need someone with operational knowledge to help us connect the dots." Rebecca looked around the range, noting that several key personnel had arrived. early and were watching the proceedings with obvious interest. Staff Sergeant Webb stood near the equipment shed, his usual confidence replaced by nervous energy that suggested he understood the significance of the morning's gathering. "What exactly do you need from me?" Rebecca asked. Agent Stevens opened a briefcase and withdrew a digital tablet loaded with files and photographs. "We need you to walk us through Operation Iron Gate from your perspective. Every detail, every decision, every communication. We need to understand how the official reports differ from what actually happened." Rebecca accepted the tablet and began scrolling through mission documents she hadn't seen in months. The memories came flooding back, the impossible timeline, the inadequate intelligence, the political pressure that had forced operational decisions based on wishful thinking rather than tactical reality. "The mission was doomed from the start," she said quietly. "The intelligence was 3 weeks old, the terrain analysis was incomplete, and the extraction timeline was impossible given the known threat conditions. But you went ahead anyway," Martinez observed. "Orders are orders. But I modified my position to provide better overwatch than the original plan called for. That modification saved the mission." "According to your original reports," Stevens said, consulting his notes. "But the official after-action review blamed your position change for compromising team security." Rebecca's jaw tightened as she remembered the betrayal of that review. "My position change allowed me to engage 6 targets that would have overrun the extraction team. Without that intervention, we would have lost 12 operators instead of 2. 2? General Williams looked up sharply. "The official reports list 7 casualties." 2, Rebecca confirmed. "Sergeant Davis and Corporal Martinez were the only fatalities, both from IED explosions that occurred before my engagement began. The other 5 names on the casualty report were added later." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Inflating casualty figures was a serious crime, one that suggested the cover-up went deeper than simple scapegoating. Martinez was typing rapidly on her own tablet, recording every word. "Ms. Thompson, do you have any theory about why someone would inflate the casualty figures?" "Political cover," Rebecca replied without hesitation. Someone needed a disaster to justify their earlier decisions. A mission with 2 casualties isn't a disaster. It's an acceptable loss given the circumstances. But 7 casualties suggests command failure that requires investigation. An investigation would have revealed the intelligence failures and political interference that set the mission up for failure, Stevens concluded. "Exactly. So they created a narrative where the mission failed because of operator error, specifically my failure to follow the operational plan." General Williams leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. "Ms. Thompson, what you're describing isn't just career assassination. It's potential fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal statutes regarding false official statements." Before Rebecca could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Colonel Harrison. He walked across the range with measured steps, but his expression suggested someone facing an uncomfortable conversation. "General Williams," he said formally, "I understand you're conducting interviews regarding personnel assignments, among other things," the general replied coolly. "Colonel, we need to discuss Ms. Thompson's original reassignment to your facility." Harrison's face went carefully neutral. "That assignment came through normal administrative channels. A routine personnel transfer based on operational requirements." "Routine?" Agent Stevens looked up from his notes. "Colonel, Ms. Thompson was transferred to your facility with administrative restrictions that effectively ended her operational career. That seems excessive for a routine reassignment." "I was following orders from higher authority," Harrison replied, but his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "Whose orders?" Martinez asked, her pen poised over her legal pad. The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired shot. Colonel Harrison looked around the range, noting the gathered personnel who were watching the exchange with obvious interest. His position was becoming increasingly uncomfortable as the scope of the investigation became clear. "I'd prefer to discuss this in a more private setting," he said finally. "I'm sure you would," General Williams replied. "But Ms. Thompson has the right to hear the answers to these questions. After all, they concern her career and reputation." Harrison's gaze found Rebecca, and she saw something there that might have been regret or possibly fear. "Ms. Thompson, I want you to know that your assignment here wasn't personal. I was told you needed a cooling-off period after a mission that had gone badly." "Told by whom?" Stevens pressed. "Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, David Kellner. He called personally to ensure the transfer was handled with appropriate ... discretion." The name hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Kellner had been one of the officials who'd pushed for Operation Iron Gate despite the obvious intelligence problems. He'd been present at the briefings where operators had raised concerns about the mission timeline and threat assessment. "Kellner," she said quietly. "He was the one who overruled our request for additional reconnaissance time." Martinez looked up sharply. "You're saying that the same official who helped create the conditions for mission failure was the one who arranged your punishment for that failure?" "That's exactly what I'm saying." General Williams turned to Colonel Harrison with an expression that could have frozen desert air. "Colonel, did Secretary Kellner provide any specific guidance about Miss Thompson's assignment restrictions?" Harrison shifted uncomfortably. He emphasized that she should be kept away from operational duties until a full review could be completed. He said there were concerns about her judgment and reliability. "Based on what evidence?" Stevens asked. I assume the evidence was in her personnel file." "Her personnel file shows nothing but commendations and successful mission completions," Martinez said coldly. "What you're describing sounds like character assassination based on false information." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Sergeant Kane, who approached the group with obvious urgency. "General Williams," he said formally, "I believe there's something you should know about yesterday's demonstration." "What about it, Sergeant?" Kane glanced at Rebecca, then back to the general. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about the shot she made. 1,700 yards, unfamiliar weapon, challenging conditions. That's not just good shooting, that's world-class precision." "Your point, Sergeant. My point is that someone with those skills doesn't develop judgment problems overnight. And someone with that level of training doesn't get assigned to administrative duties without a very specific reason." General Williams nodded slowly. "Sergeant Kane, would you be willing to provide a written statement about Ms. Thompson's demonstrated capabilities?" "Yes, ma'am. And I believe several other range personnel would be willing to do the same." Rebecca looked around the range, seeing faces that had changed from mockery to respect over the past few days. These were professional soldiers who recognized injustice when they saw it, who understood that what had happened to her could happen to any of them. Staff Sergeant Webb approached the group hesitantly, his earlier confidence completely gone. "General Williams, ma'am, I'd like to apologize to Ms. Thompson for my behavior over the past few days." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "Apology accepted, Staff Sergeant. You were working with incomplete information." "That's no excuse for unprofessional conduct," Webb replied. "I should have recognized, someone with your skills shouldn't have been assigned to administrative duties," General Williams finished. "Which brings us back to the question of why that assignment was made." Agent Stevens closed his notebook and looked around the assembled group. "I think we have enough to move forward with formal charges. Ms. Thompson, are you prepared to testify about Operation Iron Gate and its aftermath?" Rebecca stood up slowly, feeling the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. She looked across the range where she'd been humiliated and dismissed, where her expertise had been mocked and her contributions ignored. Then she thought about all the other operators who might face similar treatment if this conspiracy was allowed to continue. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm ready to testify." The words seemed to echo across the desert range, carrying with them the promise of justice long delayed but finally within reach. The hearing room in the Pentagon was nothing like the desert training range where this story had begun. Sterile fluorescent lighting replaced blazing sunshine. Conference tables substituted for shooting mats, and the controlled atmosphere bore no resemblance to the challenging wind conditions that had started everything. But for Rebecca, walking into that room felt like preparing for the most important shot of her career. 3 weeks had passed since her conversation with General Williams and the investigators. 3 weeks of intensive preparation, document review, and legal coaching. Now she sat at the witness table, facing a panel of senior officials whose decisions would determine not just her future, but the accountability of those who had destroyed her career. The panel was impressive and intimidating in equal measure. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Admiral Thompson presided over proceedings that included representatives from multiple agencies and oversight committees. The Secretary of Defense himself was present, along with officials whose ranks and titles suggested this investigation had reached the highest levels of government. Across the room, Rebecca could see Deputy Assistant Secretary David Kellner, the man whose phone call had banished her to administrative purgatory. He sat with his legal team, projecting the confidence of someone who believed his position made him untouchable. Laura Martinez, the DOD Inspector General's counsel, rose to begin her presentation. Over the past weeks, she'd become more than Rebecca's legal representative. She'd become an advocate for institutional accountability that transcended any individual case. "Ladies and gentlemen," Martinez began, "what we will demonstrate today is a systematic conspiracy to cover up intelligence, failures, and command negligence by destroying the career of an exemplary operator who threatened to expose the truth." She activated a wall display showing Operation Iron Gate mission parameters, comparing the official briefing materials with intelligence that had been available but ignored. Operation Iron Gate was doomed from conception. Outdated intelligence, political pressure to meet unrealistic timelines, and command decisions that prioritized expediency over operational security. When the mission encountered problems that should have been anticipated, those responsible needed a scapegoat. Rebecca watched the faces of the panel members as Martinez walked them through the evidence. Some showed obvious anger at what was being revealed. Others maintained careful neutrality that suggested they were still evaluating the allegations. Ms. Thompson, Martinez continued, was chosen as that scapegoat because her modifications to the operational plan modifications that saved the mission provided a convenient excuse for those who had created the conditions for failure. Admiral Thompson leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Martinez, these are serious allegations. I trust you have evidence to support them?" "Extensive evidence, Admiral, including communications that were deliberately excluded from the original investigation." Martinez activated another display showing email exchanges between Kellner and other officials in the days following Operation Iron Gate. The messages revealed a coordinated effort to control the narrative and ensure that blame fell on operational personnel rather than command decisions. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten as she read the callous language used to discuss her career destruction. To these men, she hadn't been a person with years of dedicated service. She'd been a problem to be managed, a potential threat to be neutralized. "Mr. Kellner," Admiral Thompson said, turning to face the Deputy Secretary, "do you recognize these communications?" Kellner consulted briefly with his attorney before responding. "Admiral, I don't recall the specific details of these exchanges. The period following Operation Iron Gate was chaotic, with multiple investigations and reviews underway simultaneously. You don't recall personally calling Colonel Harrison to arrange Ms. Thompson's administrative reassignment. As I said, Admiral, there were multiple personnel actions during that period. I can't be expected to remember every conversation. Rebecca felt a flash of cold anger at the casual dismissal. These were the same evasion tactics she'd encountered for months. Plausible deniability wrapped in bureaucratic doublespeak. Admiral Thompson's expression suggested he was equally unimpressed with Kellner's convenient memory loss. Ms. Thompson, you've heard Mr. Kellner's testimony. Do you have anything to add? Rebecca stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This was her chance, not just for personal vindication, but to ensure accountability for those who'd abused their power. Admiral, 3 weeks ago I was sitting on a folding chair in the desert, being mocked by personnel who assumed I was incompetent. Support staff. That assignment wasn't accident or routine personnel management. It was punishment designed to destroy my career and silence my knowledge of what really happened during Operation Iron Gate. She gestured toward the evidence displays, her voice carrying the controlled intensity that had once made her legendary in operational communities. Mr. Kellner didn't just arrange my reassignment. He orchestrated a campaign to ensure I could never challenge the false narrative that protected his reputation. When I tried to provide accurate testimony about the mission, my statements were classified beyond my clearance level. When I requested access to mission records, those requests were denied. When I sought legal representation, I was told the matter was close to further review. Rebecca paused, letting the weight of those revelations settle on the room. But Mr. Kellner made one critical error. He assumed that burying me in administrative duties would keep me silent permanently. He never considered that eventually someone would notice that the woman they were mocking could make shots that few people in the world are capable of. Admiral Thompson nodded slowly. Ms. Thompson, in your professional opinion, what would have happened if you hadn't modified your position during Operation Iron Gate? Complete mission failure, Admiral. The extraction team would have been overrun, and we would have lost 12 operators instead of 2. My position change allowed me to engage 6 targets that were positioning for an assault on our people. And this position change was the basis for the negative evaluation that destroyed your career. Yes, Admiral. They claimed I violated operational parameters and compromised mission security. The truth is exactly the opposite. Kellner's attorney requested permission to cross-examine, but his questions only reinforced the strength of Rebecca's testimony. Every answer she gave was precise, detailed, and supported by evidence that painted a picture of institutional betrayal that grew more damning by the minute. The final blow came when Martinez introduced testimony from Master Sergeant Kane and other range personnel who had witnessed Rebecca's demonstration. Their statements established beyond doubt that someone with her capabilities could never have been legitimately assigned to administrative duties based on performance concerns. Ladies and gentlemen, Martinez concluded, what we have here is clear evidence of conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of power at the highest levels. Miss Thompson's career was destroyed not because of any failure on her part, but because she represented a threat to those who have failed in their duties. Admiral Thompson called for a brief recess, during which Rebecca found herself surrounded by panel members and officials who wanted to express their support and outrage at what had been revealed. When proceedings resumed, the Admiral's expression was grim. After reviewing the evidence presented today, this panel finds clear and convincing proof of misconduct by officials charged with maintaining the integrity of our personnel systems. Mr. Kellner, you are hereby relieved of your duties pending formal criminal investigation. Additional personnel actions will follow as this investigation expands. Rebecca felt a wave of vindication and relief that was almost overwhelming. Justice, so long delayed, was finally being served. But Admiral Thompson wasn't finished. Ms. Thompson, this panel owes you an apology on behalf of the institution that failed you. Your service record speaks for itself, and the injustice you've endured is a stain on all of us. He paused, consulting notes before continuing. Effective immediately, you are restored to your previous rank and classification. All negative evaluations related to Operation Iron Gate are expunged from your record. Additionally, you are being awarded the Defense Superior Service Medal for your actions during that mission. Actions that saved American lives despite the negligence of those charged with supporting you. The room erupted in applause, but Rebecca barely heard it. She was thinking about the desert range where this journey had begun, about the men who had mocked her ignorance while remaining ignorant themselves of what they were witnessing. Furthermore, Admiral Thompson continued, you are being offered assignment to the Special Operations Command's Training Division, where your expertise can be used to develop the next generation of precision marksmen. Rebecca stood at attention, feeling the weight of vindication and new responsibility settling on her shoulders. Thank you, Admiral. I accept. As the hearing concluded and officials began filing out, Rebecca found herself approached by General Williams. How does it feel? The general asked. Rebecca considered the question carefully. Like justice, General. Long delayed, but justice nonetheless. Any regrets about fighting back? Rebecca thought about the past weeks, the investigation, the testimony, the personal cost of challenging institutional power. Then she thought about the other operators who might face similar treatment if this kind of conspiracy was allowed to continue. None at all, General. Someone had to stand up to them. General Williams smiled. Ghost 6 isn't just a call sign, is it? It's a statement of principle. Rebecca returned the smile, feeling lighter than she had in months. Yes, ma'am, it is. As she walked out of the Pentagon and into the afternoon sunlight, Rebecca felt the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. The shot that had started everything, that demonstration of skill on a desert range, had led to accountability that reached the highest levels of government. But more than that, it had led to the restoration of her true identity. She was no longer the anonymous support staffer with a clipboard. She was Ghost 6, and she was back where she belonged. 6 months later, Rebecca stood at the edge of a different kind of range, not the harsh desert facility where her resurrection had begun, but the pristine training grounds of the Special Operations Command's Advanced Marksmanship School. The mountains of North Carolina rose around her like protective walls, and the morning air carried the scent of pine instead of sand and sagebrush. But the satisfaction she felt was the same. She was home. Ma'am, the new class is ready for orientation, reported Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, her newly assigned assistant instructor. Walsh was young, eager, and possessed of the kind of natural talent that reminded Rebecca of herself 15 years ago. Rebecca nodded, checking her watch. The morning session would begin with 12 students, all experienced snipers, all convinced. They understood the limits of precision shooting, all about to discover they had much to learn. How do they look, Walsh? Confident, the younger woman replied with a slight smile. Maybe too confident. Rebecca returned the smile. Perfect. Confidence needs to be earned, not assumed. She walked toward the classroom building, her steps purposeful and sure. The intervening months had transformed more than just her assignment. They had restored her sense of purpose and professional identity. The woman who had once sat behind a clipboard, absorbing mockery and blame, was gone forever. The scandal that had followed her Pentagon testimony had reached deep into the military establishment. Kellner was facing federal charges for conspiracy and fraud. 3 other officials had been relieved of duty pending investigation. The entire system for handling mission reviews had been overhauled to prevent future cover-ups. Most importantly, for Rebecca, the truth about Operation Iron Gate had been fully revealed. The families of the fallen operators now knew their loved ones had died due to intelligence failures and political pressure, not operator error. The survivors had been properly honored, and the lessons learned had been incorporated into training protocols that would save lives in future missions. But personal vindication, satisfying as it was, had proven less important than the opportunity to pass on her knowledge to the next generation. Teaching was different from operational work, but no less challenging and far more rewarding than she'd expected. Rebecca entered the classroom to find 12 students seated at attention, 8 men and 4 women, all wearing the kind of quiet confidence that came from proven ability under fire. She recognized some of the faces from operational reports, others from their growing reputations in special operations communities. "Good morning," she said simply, taking her position at the front of the room. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Thompson, but for the next 8 weeks, you can call me Instructor 6. A few eyebrows raised at the calcine reference, but no one spoke. They'd all heard the stories by now, the legendary contractor who disappeared into administrative obscurity, only to emerge and take down a conspiracy that reached the Pentagon's highest levels. "Before we begin," Rebecca continued, "I want to address what some of you are thinking. Yes, I'm the person who made that shot on the Colorado range. Yes, I was the one they called Ghost 6. And yes, I spent several months getting my career destroyed by people who valued politics over truth." She paused, letting that sink in. But none of that matters here. What matters is what you're going to learn over the next 8 weeks, and whether you're prepared to challenge everything you think you know about precision shooting. Rebecca activated a wall display showing targets at various ranges and environmental conditions. Unlike the sterile charts used in most training facilities, these were photographs from actual missions, real shots taken under hostile conditions where accuracy meant survival. "Advanced marksmanship isn't about equipment or technique," she said, gesturing to the images. "It's about developing the mental discipline to perform under conditions that would break most people. It's about reading environments that your instruments can't measure. It's about making shots that theory says are impossible." One of the students, a young man whose records showed exceptional promise, raised his hand. "Ma'am, what's the longest shot you've ever made?" Rebecca studied his face, seeing the mixture of curiosity and skepticism that she remembered from her own early training. 2,100 yards, she replied. "Hostile conditions, moving targets, single-shot opportunity. But that's not the important question. What is the important question? The important question is whether you're prepared to develop the skills that would allow you to make that shot if the mission required it." She clicked to the next slide, showing environmental data from the Colorado range where her public revelation had begun. 6 months ago, I was sitting behind a desk, being dismissed as incompetent support staff by people who had never faced real pressure. They assumed that because I was quiet and unassuming, I must be weak. They were wrong. Rebecca's voice carried the quiet intensity that had once made her legendary in operational communities. Over the next 8 weeks, you're going to learn that true strength doesn't come from bravado or posturing. It comes from the quiet confidence that develops when you've mastered yourself as completely as you've mastered your weapon. The morning progressed with assessments and baseline shooting that established each student's current capability. Rebecca moved among them with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in her environment, offering advice that was precise, practical, and immediately effective. During the lunch break, she found herself approached by Captain Sarah Mitchell, one of the 4 women in the class, and someone whose operational record suggested exceptional potential. "Ma'am," Mitchell said, "I wanted to thank you for what you did. Taking on the Pentagon, exposing the cover, .. That took courage that most of us can't imagine." Rebecca considered the comment carefully. "Captain, courage isn't about taking on institutions or fighting conspiracies. Courage is about doing what's right, even when it costs you everything. But you got justice in the end. I got vindication, Rebecca corrected. Justice would have been preventing the injustice in the first place. But sometimes vindication is the best we can manage. Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. Is that why you're teaching now? To prevent future injustices? I'm teaching because knowledge is meant to be shared. Because the techniques that kept me alive through dozens of impossible missions shouldn't die with me. Because somewhere out there is another operator who's going to face conditions that will test every limit of their training. Rebecca paused, looking across the range where her students were preparing for the afternoon session. When that moment comes, I want them to have every possible advantage. I want them to go home to their families. And I want them to know that someone believed in their potential enough to share the hardest-earned lessons of a lifetime. The afternoon session took the students to the advanced range, where targets were positioned at distances that would challenge their preconceptions about what was possible. Rebecca watched them work, noting the subtle signs that separated the merely competent from the potentially exceptional. Distance shooting isn't about strength or equipment, she called out as they struggled with the challenging conditions. It's about patience, observation, and the willingness to wait for the perfect moment rather than forcing an imperfect shot. She demonstrated with her own rifle, not the borrowed weapon that had started her journey back to respectability, but her personal system that had been returned along with her security clearance. The students watched in silence as she settled into position with the fluid efficiency of someone who had performed these movements thousands of times. The shot, when it came, was perfect. Not because of superior equipment or favorable conditions, but because Rebecca had learned to read variables that others couldn't perceive and to execute under pressure that would paralyze most shooters. How? Asked the young man who had questioned her earlier. Rebecca stood gracefully, saving her weapon with practiced efficiency. Practice. 10,000 hours of practice under conditions that would make today's session feel like a vacation. But the technique can be taught, Rebecca interrupted. Instinct cannot. Instinct comes from surviving situations where perfect technique isn't enough, where you have to adapt and improvise and somehow find a way to make the impossible shot. She looked around at the assembled students, seeing faces that reflected varying degrees of understanding and ambition. Some of you will develop that instinct. Others will become excellent technical shooters who perform well under controlled conditions. Both paths have value, but only one will prepare you for the moments when everything depends on a single shot. As the day concluded and equipment was secured, Rebecca found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this place. The humiliation and betrayal seemed like distant memories now, replaced by the satisfaction of meaningful work and restored purpose. Staff Sergeant Webb appeared as she was locking her equipment case. The man who had once mocked her ignorance now approached with obvious respect and something that might have been embarrassment. "Ma'am," he said formally, "I wanted to apologize again for my behavior at the Colorado facility." Rebecca looked at him steadily. "Staff Sergeant, you've apologized sufficiently. What matters now is what you learned from the experience." "I learned not to make assumptions about people based on appearances or assignments." "Good lesson, but there's a deeper one." Webb frowned. "Ma'am?" "The deeper lesson is about institutional culture and how it can blind us to injustice. You didn't mock me because you're a bad person. You mocked me because the system had created an environment where that behavior seemed acceptable." Rebecca closed her case and turned to face him fully. "The real test isn't whether you apologize for past behavior. The real test is whether you'll speak up when you see someone else being treated unfairly, even if that person can't defend themselves." Webb nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am, I understand. I hope you do, Staff Sergeant. Because the next person who needs defending might not have the skills to eventually prove their worth. They might just be destroyed by the experience." As Webb walked away, Rebecca felt the satisfaction of a lesson taught and hopefully learned. Individual accountability was important, but systemic change required people to recognize their role in perpetuating injustice. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Master Sergeant Kane, who had become something of a mentor and friend over the intervening months. "Saw the news about your promotion to full colonel. Well deserved. When you start the new assignment?" Rebecca smiled as she typed her response. "Next month. Special Operations Command wants me to head up a new program for advanced environmental analysis. Apparently, they think there's value in training shooters to read conditions that instruments can't measure." Kane's reply came quickly. About time they figured that out. Ghost 6 is officially back in business. Rebecca looked across the range, one final time before heading to her vehicle. The mountains rose around her like ancient guardians, and the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold that reminded her of better times and brighter futures. She was no longer the woman who had sat behind a clipboard, absorbing mockery and injustice while her expertise was dismissed and her contributions ignored. She was no longer the scapegoat for other people's failures or the victim of institutional conspiracy. She was Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Thompson, soon to be Colonel Thompson, teacher of the impossible and master of the art that had defined her life. She was Ghost 6, and she had found her way home. The drive back to her quarters took her past the memorial wall where the names of fallen operators were engraved in black marble. She stopped, as she always did, to pay her respects to those who hadn't made it home. Among them were Sergeant Davis and Corporal Martinez, the two men who had actually died during Operation Iron Gate, not the inflated casualty list that had been used to destroy her career. Standing before their names, Rebecca felt the weight of responsibility that came with survival and vindication. She had been given a second chance, an opportunity to use her skills and knowledge in service of those who would follow. She intended to make the most of it. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky as she finally reached her quarters. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, and new opportunities to pass on the lessons that had cost her so much to learn. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Rebecca felt complete. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The woman who had once been dismissed as incompetent support staff was now recognized as one of the most skilled marksmen in the military. The conspiracy that had tried to bury her had been exposed and destroyed. The officials who had abused their power were facing the consequences of their actions. And somewhere in the mountains of North Carolina, 12 students were learning that true precision came not from equipment or technique, but from the patient development of skills that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Justice had been served. Purpose had been restored. And Ghost 6 was back where she belonged, not hidden behind a clipboard or buried in administrative obscurity, but standing proudly in the light, sharing the deadly knowledge that made legends out of those brave enough to master it. The desert range where her journey had begun seemed like a lifetime ago, but the lessons learned there about courage, persistence, and the price of truth would guide her for the rest of her career. Rebecca Thompson had found her way home, and she intended to make sure that no one else would ever face the journey she had been forced to make alone. The story that had begun with mockery and dismissal had ended with vindication and purpose. And in the morning, it would begin again with new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that skill, properly applied, could overcome any obstacle. Ghost 6 was back in business, and the legend would continue. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.